Welcome back. Today we are making a Rocky Road cake. This cake is inspired by all the flavors that are in Rocky Road ice cream, so lots of chocolate, marshmallows, and chopped nuts. I used my go-to chocolate layer cake recipe to make this cake, and I'm frosting it with a marshmallow buttercream. I added a generous layer of buttercream on top of each cake layer, and I smoothed the frosting using a large offset spatula. Next, I topped my buttercream with a very generous drizzle of some chocolate ganache. This is the same chocolate ganache that we're going to use to add drips to the sides of the cake, and it also makes great drizzles for the inside of cakes. On top of the chocolate ganache, I added a bunch of chopped walnuts. You can use whatever nut you prefer. If you want to use pecans, that's totally fine too. And then I couldn't forget the mini marshmallows. I added a tiny bit of buttercream on top of this just to help the cake layers stick together as I assembled the cake. So this cake is really loaded up with filling. As you can see, it's already starting to overflow. And that's kind of the fun of this cake, is really loading it up with everything you love. But it is a little bit messy. So you can either add a little bit less frosting and filling than I'm adding here. Or you can see once we start to crumb coat the cake, you can kind of get all of it back inside to create a nice smooth crumb coat. So I repeated this process with my cake layers, and I'm using 4 7-inch cake layers. I used a serrated knife to level each cake layer to make it nice and flat. This is important because, as you can see, this cake is already a little bit unstable with all of those fillings, and if we had domed cake layers, it would be even more of a mess. So by using nice and level cake layers, it makes the assembly a bit easier. Once I finished filling my cake and all of my cake layers were stacked, I gently pressed on top of that top layer just to make sure that everything was settled and that there wasn't any air trapped in between the layers. Then I went to work on my crumb coat. For this, as you can see, I used my offset spatula to help some of those mini marshmallows and chopped up nuts get back inside the cake. And then I added a little bit of extra frosting around the cake to make sure that all the cake layers were fully covered. I used my bench scraper to smooth this crumb coat, and then I popped the cake into the freezer for about 5 minutes to allow the frosting to firm up. This is great because it also helps the cake keep its structure and makes it a lot easier to add that second layer of frosting. When I'm frosting a cake, I like to add a really big dollop to the top, kind of spread it over the edge of the cake just like this, and then work my way down the sides of the cake. I like this method because it makes sure that there's lots of extra frosting up at that top rim of the cake, which is important when you want to get sharp edges on your cake. Once my frosting was smoothed, I added some chopped walnuts around the base of the cake with a large spoon. I then gently pressed them into the frosting using a small offset spatula. Next, I popped the cake into the freezer to allow it to chill before we add the drips. During that time, I worked on my Rocky Road mock ice cream scoops. So I've taken 2 cups of my marshmallow buttercream, and I'm mixing in 1 cup of melted chocolate. So I melted the chocolate and I've allowed it to cool for about 10 minutes so that it's still liquid, but it won't melt the frosting once it's added. Then I mixed in about a half a cup of my chopped walnuts, along with 1 cup of mini marshmallows. I folded the mixture together with a rubber spatula, and once everything was fully combined, I began to make my mock Rocky Road ice cream scoops. Using a medium-sized cookie scoop, I took some generous scoops of our buttercream and added them to a parchment-lined baking sheet. I ended up making about 11 scoops, and I only actually needed 7 to add to the top of the cake, but it's good to have a few extras just in case some don't turn out or are a little bit misshapen. So I popped our ice cream scoops into the freezer and took out our cake. The frosting was firm to the touch, so I went to work adding on our ganache strips. I like to use a squirt bottle because I think it's easiest, but if you don't have one on hand, you can always use a spoon instead. I added a bit of extra ganache to the top of the cake to cover it, but I did save a little bit extra for garnishing our ice cream scoops. Once the top was covered, I picked up my frozen ice cream scoops and carefully placed them around the perimeter of the cake. So as you can see, they're frozen, so they're easy to handle. And once they were all in place, I added a little bit more chocolate ganache to the top, as well as a sprinkle of chopped walnuts. Now, the maraschino cherries don't really tie into Rocky Road, but they remind me of ice cream sundaes, and this cake definitely needed a little pop of color, and I think that's exactly what these cherries give this cake. So that's it, our Rocky Road cake is complete, and now it's time to cut in. So amazingly enough, despite the kind of gloopy mess we started with, the layers really look perfect, and the ganache is almost marbled throughout the layers with the marshmallows. This cake is so delicious. If you guys want to recreate it, the recipe is up on Chelsweets.com. Thanks so much for watching this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and hopefully I'll see you guys again soon.